Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this month's Icsa meeting. This is an open meeting for the community regarding issues that are of a nature related to cultic involvement. So tonight's speaker is Phil Elberg. He is an attorney with both professional and personal experience with cults. He has represented individuals harmed by cultic experience and has both written and spoken on the subject. He is a former president of Icsa and was the first recipient of Icsa's Margaret Singer Award for his contribution to the understanding of coercive influence. More information about Attorney Elberg can be found on the Icsa website, icsahome.com. So please welcome Phil Elberg on Cults, the Law, a Practical Guide.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you all. I am really happy to be here. This invitation has gotten me to start writing in a more serious way about a variety of topics that are near and dear to me. And because I've started writing about them, I've decided to do something different than what I've usually done when I've spoken in the past, where I do something fairly described as closer to winging it with a few notes. So I've written what I want to say, and I will be reading more than I ever have before in speaking to a group. I'd ask you to bear with me. I appreciate that what many of you seek is practical advice about the legal issues associated with personal or family involvement in cultic groups. And I'll just list what those issues are. Keeping a family member from joining a toxic group, getting them out once they're in, preventing a loved one from turning over financial assets to the group, for attempting to speak about a cultic group, particularly on the internet, after leaving as part of the healing process and to help others, suing the group or its leader for economic and emotional damages arising from cultic involvement, handling family court issues of custody and visitation when one parent remains and one leaves or one joins, creating challenges in the marriage or the relationship, and proof of brainwashing to excuse criminal conduct, mitigate a criminal penalty, or convince prosecutors to pursue a prosecution of a group or its leader. I hope to touch on each of these issues, and I will make myself available to answer questions about each of them. But I think what I can contribute is a practical perspective about our legal system that creates the framework in which all of these issues can be understood. Before I get to that, though, it's important, at least for me, to explain how I got here. And I don't mean on New Jersey Transit and the 1 train. I don't think any of us expected some years back to be sitting in this church basement tonight. I know I didn't, but here we are. And since I'm the speaker, I'm going to indulge for a few minutes. I hope that my story helps provide a context and maybe lend some credibility to my conclusions, which have evolved over the years and are grounded in my own efforts to resolve the tension between my practical experience as a practicing lawyer and my personal experience as someone whose life was impacted by cultic involvement in my family. In 1998, a bit more than 20 years ago, I was 53 years old and the managing partner of a small but successful law firm located in Newark, New Jersey. We didn't advertise in any way or work on a large volume of cases. Our office was in Newark's premier office location rather than in the neighborhood. Our work was primarily referred by other lawyers, and a portion of it was medical malpractice work. All of it was litigation. My partner was one of the best-known civil litigators in the state. He'd been president of the State Trial Lawyers Association. I was his second chair, generated much of the business, and managed the firm. I'm comfortable saying that my firm had a solid reputation among the judiciary and the bar. There was a case in my office being doggedly pursued by a younger lawyer. It involved a young woman in her 20s suffering from bipolar disorder with a history of mental illness and hospitalizations. Her mother sought a lawyer to pursue a case against the behavior modification drug treatment center where her daughter was treated for 4.5 years between the ages of 15 and 19. A therapist encouraged the mom to find a lawyer because he believed that improper treatment at the rehab had made her underlying mental illness more intractable to treatment. For many reasons, malpractice cases for psychiatric damages sought on behalf of plaintiffs with history of mental illness who were confined at what was generally thought of as a drug rehab for many years are not economically viable. And lawyers, particularly good lawyers, are hard to find. In this case, like in many cases of mental illness, even the diagnosis was ambiguous, and the head of the treatment center was an impressive man with credentials and the support of many politicians, including the national fundraising chairman of the Republican Party and treatment experts. He was surrounded, the head of the center was surrounded by a group of devoted followers who believed he had saved their lives or their children's lives. And they backed up their fervor with their energy, their time, and their money. The case was also problematic because when people heard about the case, their typical reaction was to wonder why, if the facility was as bad as we were going to say it was, her parents had kept her there for 4.5 years. And if she really was mentally ill, how much had the parents contributed to that mental illness? On the other hand, the program and its leader were controversial. There had been a TV show in which former patients and families described it as cult-like. There were reports of physical abuse and of people staying for years and never leaving. And there was a treating psychiatrist willing to help. After 2 years on the case, the lawyer in my firm, the younger lawyer who was working on it, was ready to give it up and let it go. It was a contingent fee case, which meant that if we didn't collect money, we would not be paid. And he was worried about investing more and more time and money in a marginal matter. I was at a point in my life where I was bored, I was restless, and looking for something to throw myself into. I started looking at the file. Slowly but surely, I put in first the toe, and then more and more of me, until eventually I was working on little else. That case, the first of what I refer to as the kids' cases, because that was the name of the treatment center, took over and eventually changed my life. I figured out over a period of time that the rehab center's founder, a man named Miller Newton, was a real deal cult leader in the Jim Jones, Keith Raniere sense. Desperate and unsuspecting parents looking for help were conned into turning their lives and their children's lives over to him, only to eventually face enormous and sometimes insurmountable difficulty in getting their children and their lives back. It's fair to say that by the time the kids' cases were over, it had become like most cult stories, an unbelievable but nevertheless true tale that you think it can't get any worse, only it does, over again and over again, until you realize that you may never find the hellish bottom. The kid's story did for me, once I understood it, what cults do to their members. It divided the world into people who get it and people who don't. And it became a bit like tar, in that it's been hard to get off. Why did I pick up the file, put my toes in, and why did I get sucked in? I'm going to back up from 1998 to 1970, almost 30 years earlier. During the summer of 1970, I was a third-year law student, trying to get over being dumped by my college sweetheart. I found a talk therapist, moved out of New York City to New Jersey, where Rutgers Law School was located. I was 24 years old. My sister Gail was 2 years younger. I'm not going to describe her, other than to say that she was the most guileless and sincerest person I'd ever known. Every good quality I had, she seemed to have more of. And what she didn't have was my anger, my angst, and the chip which occasionally found its way onto my shoulder. She returned that summer from a year as a Vista volunteer on an Indian reservation in Nevada. She had started a relationship with another volunteer that ended when the year was over and they headed to their respective homes on the East Coast. Gail had no plans other than that she wanted to do good and help others and make friends. She saw a small ad in the Village Voice for a program based on the educational philosophy expressed and described in the book Summerhill, that advocated a new philosophy of education based on giving children more freedom in choosing their curriculum and de-emphasized academic achievement as the goal of primary education. She attended meetings on a couple of Friday nights in a meeting room which in my imagination is very much like the one we're in tonight, where she met the individual who placed the ad. His name was Fred Newman. This may get confusing because we're going to be talking about Miller Newton a bit and Fred Newman. And I'll try to use their first names as well so as not to confuse you. His name was Fred Newman. He had a PhD in philosophy, and he was a former philosophy professor at City College. Gail and Fred quickly began a relationship that Gail and the family members she introduced him to, including me, thought was monogamous. In short order, he was a boyfriend, and Gail became one of the first members of what evolved over the years into a series of groups that operated under many names and seemed to keep growing in influence in both New York politics and in the talk therapy world. I had no understanding of cults, but it was just after the 1960s. We were all involved in the anti-war political and cultural movements of the time, and everybody worth knowing, including your speaker, spoke a fair amount of grass and was experimenting or too afraid to be experimenting with new kinds of relationships and sometimes wacky ideas. Our mother, I can shorten this by just telling you, if you were a fan of the Seinfeld show, to think of Jerry Seinfeld's mother on the Seinfeld show, started telling me that she was worried about Gail. Her concerns increased with time, and over the years, as the Anti-Defamation League started calling Gail's group anti-Semitic, she became more concerned, and there were more calls, and there was more information sent to me, unsolicited by my mother. It is fair to say that I treated my mother the way Jerry Seinfeld treated his. I tried to be a good son, and I listened. But I did very little to help, because Gail was committed to Fred Newman. My mother seemed committed to being heartbroken by it, and I had a lot of commitments. I called it a phase. My mother called it a cult. I finished law school, I got married, I had my first child, and in time started a law firm. I saw Gail from time to time, but each time she came with one or more members of her group and then had to leave quickly to get somewhere else. Or she was inviting me to one of her group's functions, where she would explain that she and they were part of something revolutionary, and that they were developing ever-increasing influence, which in retrospect, I have to admit was true. In 1996, 26 years after Gail met Fred Newman, and 2 years before I began working on the kids' case, our mother died. Her will divided the money she had among her children, but it left me the trustee of a small trust for Gail's benefit, with instructions not to give her the principal as long as she had anything to do with Fred Newman. I was initially just going to give Gail the money, but after several lunch meetings with Gail, in the aftermath of my mother's death, I changed my mind. By then, Gail was 48 years old and had never worked at a job outside the group for any length of time. With the responsibility now mine, I had no choice other than to admit to myself that if I gave her the money, she would give it to Newman. I knew the money would matter to Gail and she would need it someday, and I did exactly what my mother asked me to do. I started looking at the kids' cases, first kids' case, a year or so after I did not give Gail the money. The story of those cases is described in a book written by my friend Maya Salovitz, Help at Any Cost, in which she focused on the trial of the case involving one of my clients, Lulu Korda, who was in the program for 13 years between the ages of 13 and 27, even though she had never engaged in drug use or compulsive behavior of any kind. There is no time to go through the details, but as you all know, every cult, whether large or small, is different in the details, but remarkably similar in its impact on the members and their loved ones. There were parents who figured it out eventually, but by then their kids were under Miller Newton's control. There were kids who figured it out and ran away, but couldn't or wouldn't reconnect with their parents because those parents remained under Newton's control. One night, as I was getting more and more involved, I didn't convince them. I was able to get 3 former patients who became drug counselors to meet me for coffee at a New Jersey diner located out on Route 23. One told me that he was owed $20,000 by Miller Newton, but Newton had told him that trying to collect the $20,000 would violate his first step, and that he would go back to drugs if he was paid what he was owed or try to collect what he was owed. The second was obviously unambiguously depressed. Everything about him was depressed, and he told me that he had jumped out of a moving car a few weeks before to get away. And the third had a regular job, but he had been asked just a few weeks earlier to falsely sign his name on a paper saying he worked at the center because they were in danger of losing their Medicaid funding because their staff was inadequate. Later I found out that a fourth person, a friend of theirs, was waiting in the parking lot in case it turned out that my plan was to take them back. I drove home that night feeling like I was looking evil with the devil in the eye and that I better not blink. Just keep working. I was up all that night and many more reading and learning the story. Learn the story and you'll figure it out was my mantra. Don't worry about the legal theory. You'll figure it out. It was a little for me like, if you build it, they'll come. Well, in the end, I did figure it out. I litigated that case and others that followed on 2 parallel tracks. First, I treated it as a malpractice case. They held themselves out as a treatment center, treating behavioral disorders. Treatment begins with a diagnosis, presumably a differential diagnosis. So I asked whether the diagnosis was correct, and then whether the care that was provided was consistent with the standard of care for the condition the patient had or they claimed she had. We were able to demonstrate that what they were doing was inconsistent with the standard of care for whatever conditions the kids had, because beatings, food deprivation, bringing kids back after they're 18, keeping kids out of school wasn't okay. In addition, I prepared a traditional malpractice case, but it allowed me to tell the story of what happened to the kids at Kids. At the same time, now fascinated by what I was learning about Miller Newton, but still involved with Fred Newman and Gail because I was managing the money for her, I pursued the possibility of proving the treatment center was a cult. I read Cults and Our Myths by Margaret Singer and Janja Lalich, and I learned about Robert Lifton's work from Bill Goldberg, a cult expert I hired. Bill wrote a first-rate report applying each of the Lifton criteria to Kids. It made sense to me. And in my mind, when I applied the criteria to Gail's group, it was obviously a cult too. I read Heart of Darkness and other Lifton work. On a family vacation at Disney World, while my wife and my youngest son went on the rides, I told her I was not going to go on the rides. I was going to stay in the room, where I read Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. I was all in. My wife gave me a look that I still remember, but I knew my life had changed. I workshopped the case and the 2 approaches. I did mock trials behind one-way mirrors with jurors selected to duplicate the potential jury pool. And it became clear that the cult analysis got me nothing and devolved into discussions of what is and what is not a cult. It was a cult. I knew it and concluded that if I just told the story as I had learned it, the jury would get it. They'd call it a cult. I would not have to ever use the C word or brainwashing, the B word. In fact, using those words made it harder for my audience, a judge and a jury, to appreciate the monstrous nature of what the victims experienced. The C word and the B word were conclusions. They weren't facts. The conclusions made Kids seem weird and wacky. But the weirdness and wackiness were ways to avoid a simpler truth. We were talking about evil. If I started with the cult allegation and accusation, I'd lose my audience's attention before I started. If I just told the story in exquisite detail, the judge and the jury would do my work for me. The trial, Lulu's trial, was covered extensively in the New Jersey Law Journal. And the headline story one week in the New Jersey Law Journal while I was trying the case was, "How do you convince a jury that your client was the victim of a cult?" That was the headline, and the article began by saying, "For Phil Elberg, you don't present expert witnesses and you don't utter the word. Through witnesses and records, you let the story tell itself. For the past 3 weeks, the partner in Newark's Medved and Elberg has been presenting evidence to a Hudson County jury about why his client should be compensated for the years she spent in a rehabilitation center." The first and the later cases ended successfully for many reasons, including the fact that the leader's desire for credibility caused him to dress up what he was doing with medical directors and insurance, which resulted in the case having a potential payoff at the end, which gave me the time and the support of my partner to pursue them. After settling the first case for a substantial sum, for me, my fascination and my desire to learn, and frankly, to feel, didn't go away. I went to a cult conference in Seattle. I attended the pre-conference where I sat with parents and felt a bit out of place because I wasn't nearly as consumed by Gail's life as they were in what felt to them like the loss of their children. But I indulged in Gail's and my family's story and thought about my mother, who had called a cult for years, while I called it a phase or a choice. I attended the educational sessions, and I have to admit, I was troubled by the focus on questions of what is and is not a cult. Is AA a cult? Are the Waldorf schools cultic? How do you prove something is a cult in court? Do you hire an expert who would define a cult? And I was initially confused at the conference when I first heard about the controversy in which sociologists, apparently a majority of sociologists, seemed to say that what I knew as a cult was just a new religion, as if by changing what you called it, he and his evil conduct could be excused and be studied rather than prosecuted. And then I heard Margaret Singer speak. She was old. She was past her prime. And like my first grade teacher, who I've tried to immortalize in stories I've made up for my granddaughters, her face had more wrinkles than a raisin, at least as I recall it. She spoke seemingly extemporaneously for just 10 or 15 minutes. She said, forget about all that complicated stuff. Cults are cons, and the people that run them are con men. Think of people playing three-card Monte on the city streets, or people that make telemarketing calls to old people trying to separate them from their savings. These are cons, and the way to expose a con is to learn how it's done and describe it. And I sat there saying to myself, that's what I'm talking about. That was what I had done. I had learned how Newton did it, and I had learned that the way to get him was to expose the specifics of the perfidy, not the manipulations, but rather the fraud and the schemes and the crimes. During the couple of years that followed, that first meeting in Seattle, I had what is fairly described as a meteoric rise and an even quicker fall as president of the Cultic Studies Association. I separated myself from the group, but worked in a somewhat connected but not nearly identical area of law as a volunteer. Miller Newton was a cult leader, but while there were many tough love programs that were terribly abusive, they weren't all long-term cons led by false gurus in the way that cults are. Every cult is a con, but every con is not a cult, and many of the boot camps and therapeutic boarding schools were simply money-making short-term cons in which operators took advantage of frightened parents, or in some cases gave narcissistic parents a place to dump their kids. I became an activist and the go-to volunteer lawyer fighting the tough love industry. I am working on this presentation. I really thought about what I did over those years, and I'm proud of that work. I occasionally attended a cult conference. I have to admit, if it was in a location I wanted to visit. But I have to admit, I was generally unhappy with the legal presentations because they were not based on the reality of our legal system as I understood it to be. Now that I'm at a point in my life with the time to reflect, I appreciate the opportunity to talk and write about what I've learned. And when I've attended these Friday meetings, I've been remarkably comfortable, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my views tonight. the law today. There is simply no law with respect to cults. Cult is a word with no legal significance. Efforts to define a cult legally or to apply a separate definition of undue influence as applied to cultic groups have not generally been successful. And in my view, any such statute would be counterproductive rather than helpful. Because there is no special law with respect to cults, there are no experts in cult law, and there are no cult lawyers. There are First Amendment experts and family law experts with relevant knowledge, and there are trust and estate experts with relevant knowledge, and sexual abuse experts with relevant knowledge. But there are no cult law experts because there is no cult law. On the other hand, there are cult leaders that harm their followers and their followers' families. An understanding of what they are, how people are tricked into becoming part of them, and the problems that they and their families face as a result of their participation can make a good lawyer more effective in helping victims. Why is there no law with respect to cults? And why is there not likely to be any in the future? Well, first, and obviously, there is no consensus about what a cult is. There are the Lifton criteria that are helpful, but they don't account for cultic relationships in very small groups. There's now the cult around our president, and there are former cults that have become mainstream religions, and there are some people that still say those groups are cultic. There are the most orthodox or extreme groups within every mainstream religion, and there is abuse of the vulnerable and defenseless, especially children and young women, in every institution that doesn't have a strong system of checks and balances as part of its culture. It doesn't lend itself to a definition that would be meaningful legally. In recent years, there has been more and more attention, and thankfully and properly so, to very small cultic relationships. And as the work in psychoanalysis, particularly Dan's group work, focuses on what the villain gets from the cultic relationship, the phenomenon becomes more clearly into focus. But those efforts also take us further away from a definition of a cult that could lead to a legal standard. Every time I hear people debate whether a particular group is or is not a cult, like those discussions I heard at the first Cultic Studies Association meeting I attended, I jump right in because I'm as interested in the subject as everybody else. But it reinforces my belief that there is no reasonable possibility of a legal standard or a definition. I'm not going to explain now why statutes are changing the law with respect to undue influence won't work, but I'll be glad to do it when we shut the camera off. If anybody wants me to explain, I'm happy to do that. The best proof that I'm right about the absence of any cult law can be seen by the absence of cases based on cult law. The two most significant cult cases in the civil and criminal law in the last 20 years, my civil cases, and in the criminal law area, the recently concluded NXIVM trial, both involved cults. In both cases, the juries and the courts knew that the case was about cults. But my case was a malpractice case, and in NXIVM the charges were sex trafficking, RICO violations, and credit card and immigration fraud. Saying that you can ignore proving it's a cult or invoking cult law is the easy part. And in fact, since I first made that point about there being no cult law 20 years ago, I think it's now been generally accepted. But making that point doesn't explain why there aren't more cult cases along the lines that were pursued by me in the kids' cases and the prosecutors in the Raniere trial. I can point to an answer. I can point to an answer to that question by again referring to my cases, to NXIVM, and to my sister's group. It took my obsession, my being all in part motivated by my sister's story, and the prospect of a big payoff at the end to give me the time and the space to commit to telling the kid's story and sending Miller Newton to Florida as a make-believe priest with a small church. But before that, there was a show on CBS television in 1989 in which the cult accusation was made clearly as to Newton and kids. And when I called Bill Goldberg about becoming an expert and asked if he'd heard of kids, he knew about it because he and Lorna had been helping out the victims for years. At that time, at the time of that TV show in 1989, my client Lulu had already been there for 5 years, out of school, and subject to hideous abuse. And as a result of the publicity around the show, the police raided the warehouse in Bergen County, where the treatment center was located, and told the kids over 18 they could leave. And what happened next is that the show was over, the police lost interest, and the treatment center reopened in Hudson County in a different warehouse in Secaucus. There were questions, but nobody shut them down in all those prior years. NXIVM was around for many years. Everybody's impressed by the NXIVM story now. But there was a cover story in Forbes magazine in 2003 about NXIVM, and a Vanity Fair article in 2010 describing how the Bronfman-heirs had been conned. And there was an impressive multi-part expose describing the missing women and suggesting that Raniere was involved with sex with underage girls in 2012 in the Albany Times-Union. And I, the hero with the kids' cases, knew in detail back in 2012 all about NXIVM. And in 2014, I knew even more, because I represented the mother of Raniere's child, who was in hiding at the time. It was all there by then, except for the branding and DOS, but nobody did anything effective about it, while greedy lawyers got rich defending it and punishing its critics. Keith Raniere, using Claire Bronfman's money, used our legal system to abuse their former members, children, and the immigration laws. It was only in 2017, late 2017, when the branding story broke in the New York Times, that there were indictments, a cover story in the Sunday Times Magazine, a trial with so many spectators there was an overflow room, and now movies, books, etc. It was the horror of the branding and the image of attractive women becoming sex slaves against the backdrop of the Me Too movement that caused a group of young women prosecutors with the unlimited resources of the U.S. Attorney's Office to go all in and make NXIVM the center of their lives. And that's what brought Raniere down. In the case of my sister's group, Fred Newman's con flourished and grew for years by promoting something called social therapy, in which people seeking help to get through a rough period in their lives, or perhaps feeling lonely and disconnected, were presented with a cure that still boggles my mind, that consisted of confession, in exchange for which you were provided with a set of political beliefs, a set of seemingly unconnected but completely connected charitable endeavors, and a community of friends, all wrapped up as a package. Remarkably, the therapy worked. In the same year that I was representing a young, decent therapist, I think she was a licensed social worker, facing disciplinary charges in New Jersey before her disciplinary board because she gave a small Christmas gift to a manipulative patient who then turned on her. Fred Newman's group engaged in practices that ignored every conceivable boundary, and instead of being disciplined by anyone, they were presenting their revolutionary approaches at American Psychological Association conferences. Why didn't that end sooner? It was not the absence of a legal definition of cults, or the absence of a law that expanded the undue influence concept. The wrongdoing was not hard to find if you looked. It was right there if you looked carefully. Part of it was that they had a lot of money, and in the NXIVM case, obscene amounts of money, that gave them access to good lawyers. And part of it was that they had the support of politicians for a variety of reasons, and in some cases, the First Amendment was on their side. But it was more than that. It was just too hard. What made it too hard flows from the nature of cultic groups. The people that go after cults, whether they're lawyers litigating a case, an ex-member or a family member, are always balancing the effort it will take in terms of time, money, and emotional energy in fighting the cult with the other priorities in their lives. Our lives have many parts. Our families, our jobs, our friends, our relatives, perhaps our religious affiliation. When things go wrong in one part of our lives, we turn to the other parts for help. I remember when I was running a lot and wanted to run a faster marathon. I realized that the additional training it would take to allow me to run faster and perhaps qualified to run in Boston was not possible unless I gave up either my family or my day job. I couldn't have all three. And I got used to running slower. But I wasn't blind to what was happening in my sister's group before I got involved in the kids' cases. And I certainly wasn't blind after I got involved in the kids' cases. When somebody decides to go after a cult, they have to decide how important that fight is to them. And they have to compare that with their need or desire to go on with their life as something other than an angry ex-member, or just the need to not have people keep telling you till you want to scream, to stop being so upset about it because it makes them uncomfortable. Going after a cult leader is somewhat akin to being a whistleblower, and being a whistleblower is a very lonely and unpleasant experience. Contrast that with the people in the group. One reason people stay in groups is because it becomes everything to them. It takes the place of their job, their family, their religion, their hobbies, their friends. That's why it's hard to leave groups. It can feel like there's nowhere to go. But while they're following their leader and someone tries to expose the con, what price will they pay or won't they pay to sustain the leader and keep the group going? When there's a real deal cult leader and followers that have become deployable agents in the group that meets the Lifton criteria and the rest, they are all in because they believe they're part of something that is world-changing, and you don't get them by calling them a name or by hurting their arm. They'll lie, cheat, and do whatever it takes inside and outside the legal system to survive, while the rest of us are dealing with competing interests. I represented a very religious man in a serious accident case years ago. I still remember his coming to my office to being deposed. He sat in my waiting room, praying and reading his religious book. I called him into my office to prepare him for the deposition, giving the instructions I'd given hundreds of times before. He told me in his accent, I shouldn't worry. Don't worry, it'll be okay. And we went into the deposition, and he started answering questions. He would have passed any lie detector test. He knew exactly what he was doing because he just was not burdened by the oath. He was dealing with a higher authority. It was in the book he was reading that he had in front of him. He knew exactly, to him, the other thing was just a game. He left, he came, he went, and now the other side had to decide whether how much time and money they wanted to spend proving that he was lying. I don't want to belabor this point, but I will simply try to simplify it by taking some license here and referencing the discussions we've all been involved in about whether the part of our lives that has consumed us the last couple of years, the president. If you want to get the problem with fighting a cult, think about what it takes to bring him down. Watch Fox News for a few minutes. Look at people living in a different reality. Look at different definitions of what is true and false. Think about cross-examining Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham. It isn't that they're playing chess and we're playing a less complicated game like checkers. It's that they're living in a different reality. A reality you're not even sure they believe in because they won't agree with you about the ground rules or the starting truths. It becomes a unique and different kind of effort to beat them. I want to move now to where I started, which were the specific issues that people deal with cults, because I don't want this to all be depressing, because I don't feel depressed about the subject. I actually feel encouraged, and I'm comfortable talking about this, and I think there are, in some cases, answers. I'll simply say I'm just going to list other things about our legal system that make our legal system less than hospitable to claims involving cults. If I was here forever, and I've probably gone too long already, here's the next group of subjects I would be discussing. One, money in our legal system, or what I call how much justice can you afford? 2, judges in our legal system are what I call, I want justice, he seems to want tuna or chicken salad for lunch. 3, the mental health profession in our legal system, or what I call Dr. Phil, and if everyone is depressed, no one is. 4, lawyers in our legal system are what I call, in an homage to George Bernard Shaw, I know what you are, I just don't know your price. 5, what makes a good plaintiff? The lawyer's search for the Holy Trinity. 6, why we make a mistake in the legal context when we talk about cults rather than cult leaders with and without access to money. And the reason that's a mistake is that talking about cults places the focus on the ideology or the stated beliefs of the group. And those are protected by the First Amendment. Rarely matter and may be no more wacky than the stated beliefs or ideology of the most well-established groups. Talking about the leader and what he does gets us much more quickly to the evil deeds. Okay, back to where I started, the 7 items, and I'm going to run through them. I don't know where I am with time.
I'm running a little long.
Okay, should I keep going? Okay. I'm going to do them in the reverse order because I think I want to end with keeping people out of a group or getting them out once they're in. I'm going to end there. So I'm going to start at the end with the criminal law and simply say this. In general, involvement in a cultic group and being brainwashed, no matter how severe, is not going to excuse criminal conduct, and it shouldn't. We wouldn't have a civilized society if we allowed people to be excused from conduct that harms others because of the harm they were subjected to themselves. That's why the Manson followers, Lee Malvo, the young boy in the Baltimore the sniper murders, Patty Hearst, and the victims of Keith Raniere who committed criminal activities need to go to prison. In some cases, perhaps for a long time. On the other hand, the degree of punishment should and can be impacted by the harm that was done to the criminal actor that led to the crime. And this is an area in which people who know cults, experts, can and should be helpful. How much prison time, how severe the punishment can be mitigated by the abuse suffered by the convicted person. And cultic involvement is a good example of that. The fascinating issue that's raised for me by the NXIVM case, and I've been thinking about it a lot and starting to write about it, are questions of who's a villain and who's a victim. The issue is going to come up at the NXIVM sentencing now, and it's going to come up particularly as the victims start fighting among themselves as the restitution pile of money is divided up. Those that were the principal crime committers that got out and became witnesses against Raniere, those that joined at the end and became sex slaves, and those that were never in the cult, but tried to con the Brahmins themselves and were then hurt by Raniere, will all be seeking a share of the pot of money. And many of them all seem to have the same lawyer, who appears to be, at least to me, to be in a conflicted position. There are also former members that hope to collect money from Claire Bronfman or call Allison Mack the most evil of all. But Claire Bronfman and Allison Mack were also the most brainwashed. Claire Bronfman because of her money, Allison Mack perhaps because of her looks, or perhaps it was a celebrity. But they were subject to special attention by Raniere, and the most brainwashed of all. At this stage, I'll simply say on this issue that finding your way into a cult is like winning the negative lottery, and that the most brainwashed, while they have to be punished criminally, should not be casually or harshly judged by those who are lucky enough not to come as close to the sun as them. Family law, the 6th thing I mentioned. I'm referring now to issues in custody battles where a parent who remains in a cult and a partner who left share a child or children, or a spouse joins a cult. You need to find a family lawyer, who hopefully one who knows the judge or at least practices in the court. And you need to get an expert therapist who hopefully who the judge respects, and if you're talking about a cult expert, additionally a local psychologist who appears regularly in the court. The legal standard in family court is the best interest of the child, and there is a prejudice in terms of not making big changes in the child's life. That provides lots of opportunity for experts and lawyers who are familiar with this area to do seriously good work on behalf of cult victims, as long as they couch that work not by starting by making the cult accusation, but rather by focusing on the best interests of the child and focusing on the terrible impact, the harm that can be done to the child in the group in the most specific, understandable, non-cultic terms. Additionally, in family court, you have to know what court to go to. In the tough love treatment center area, there was a lawyer in Utah who used to take $5,000 or $10,000 from parents, from usually non-custodial parents wanting to get their kid out of a Utah tough love program. And so with a lot of publicity, he'd do press releases and go into court and file motions describing the place in the most horrific terms and ask the judge to release the kid. The problem is the kids were from New Jersey and North Carolina and from Massachusetts, and he was in the wrong court. The Utah judge wasn't going to touch the case with a 10-foot pole, especially because the Utah judges tended to have prejudices in favor of those places. So the lawyer got his $5,000 or $10,000 and a bit of publicity. You need to be in the right court. Damages suits after you've left. This is the one I know because it was what I did, and if there are contract violations or financial crimes that are provable using traditional methods, of course they should be pursued. But the reality is, for many, many, many reasons, mental damage, emotional distress is simply not treated in the law as a practical matter the way physical injuries are. If I ask you what's worse, to suffer from depression or a broken leg, you would say to me, well, tell me about the depression, right? Maybe it's worse, maybe it's not nearly as bad. If I got up in the morning and I don't feel good and I say I'm depressed, I'd rather have that, because the next day I may feel better, than the broken leg. What's worse, first stage cancer or PTSD? It depends. You need to know the facts. But the reality is, the mental health profession has virtually no control over its language. The words, and there are lots of reasons, I'm not going to cover them now. And that's one of the reasons why the courts are just not, you don't do well with emotional damage claims in the courts. The best example I can give you of that is in, again, the tough love area, not the cult area. Well, first, there's no cases, so I rest my case. But more importantly, in the tough love area, there were many lawyers, particularly lawyers who heard about the success I had in New Jersey, who would call me, thinking when there was some story about a kid being killed or abuse and they were going to start cases. They never happened. Over the years and the years since my kids' cases, there have not been, unless there were deaths or physical injuries, there have not been any significant recoveries for emotional distress from kids abused in tough love rehab centers. So that is an area in which I think people are, I don't want to say wasting their time, but if you appreciate, in order to get a lawyer, you're going to get a lawyer in one of three categories. You're going to get a lawyer paid by the hour, and no regular person can afford to pay a lawyer by the hour. Or you're going to get a lawyer on a contingent fee basis, and lawyers are very good at contingent fee basis. I remember the second time I went to a cult conference and people started talking about there are going to be these cult cases, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember saying to myself, and I probably said it to a couple of other people too, I've been at lawyer conferences. The pursuit of money by lawyers is one of the most economically efficient endeavors known to mankind. And if there was money to be made pursuing cases on behalf of cult victims, we wouldn't be meeting in this shitty hotel. We would be at a totally different kind of hotel. And it may be funny, but it was also true. Speaking on the internet, the world has changed, with respect to that a lot. And what the cults do, in particular, when they have cults with money, they try to scare people into not pursuing, not being on the internet. Paul Grosswald, who's not here, has really done terrific work in the last couple of years on behalf of the victims of one so-called church in New Jersey, keeping the people that wanted to be on the internet. But this is an area where lawyers can be very helpful, because simply by having a lawyer and the groups knowing that a lawyer will represent you, more often than not, you can scare the group away. The cases are frivolous. The same First Amendment that presents problems for people trying to get people out of cults protects people when they want to speak about the cult after they leave. And so this is an area in which lawyers, again, I'm going to try to cut this short, but lawyers can and should be helpful in keeping people alive and focused and able to operate on the internet. One of the reasons I wrote this out was so I wouldn't move into war stories, and I wouldn't start, so I'm going to leave those out. Finally, I want to get back to 1, 2, and 3, keeping them out, keeping people out of cults and getting them out, and issues around money and preventing them from having money. I was here last month. It was seeing Pat Ryan and Joe Kelly's presentation was a revelation to me. It was wonderful, and it came so far in terms of having a nuanced understanding of the issues and an understanding that every situation is different. Here's the bottom line for me and why I wanted to end with this. If there was a law, and I'm not, if you want me to, I'll talk about the other things that concern me about proposed laws. But the single thing that makes the most difference, the 2 things that make the most difference, 3 things, in dealing with kids that are in cults or family members that are in cults, are time, good therapy for the family members who are not in the cults, and doing everything you can to maintain contact and doing what you need to do in order to be, to have non-judgmental contact with the person that's in the group. If I could go back, I have plenty of thoughts about my sister's life and the would've, could'ves, and should'ves of my life. But I'll tell you that if there was a law that existed, and I could have used it, and I could have gotten an order, a court order, that said my sister couldn't associate with Fred Newman, or my mother couldn't. And I could go back in time and have the opportunity to do it. I wouldn't do it. It would have been a mistake. And it wouldn't have worked, because how do you keep adults from having contact with each other if they want to? There is no law, obviously, that can keep somebody from associating with a cultic group. I just think this is an area in which what lawyers ought to be doing is deferring to the people that actually know what they're talking about in this area, which are the people whose thinking have evolved over the years in dealing with cult members, which are talk therapists and exit counselors, who, as I've watched their thinking evolve, I've been enormously impressed. With respect to money, I've been involved in cases in which, particularly in situations where an older person gets conned into a cult and the family gets together to try to prevent them from turning over their assets to the villain. And in those situations, the courts are much more receptive, because undue influence, that is what undue influence cases are typically about. And if people have their own money, if the person in the cult has their own money, it's very hard to stop them from spending it, unless they're an old person with senility issues. And if they're a young person, the question of whether you give them or don't give them money is one to which I'll defer to the therapists. So that's what I got. Again, thank you for the opportunity to do this. I've really enjoyed putting this together. It's been great for me.
Hello, everyone. Phil, hey. It's wonderful to meet you in person. This is the first time Phil and I have actually connected in person today, so that's exciting. Oh, wow. I just wanted to say, I just wanted to say real quickly, I acknowledge that there's a lot going on right now in our world. Outside my door. I'm sure. It sounds like
they're all up at Broad Street partying and celebrating, banging the pan. So if you hear some excitement in the background, it's not my bird. It is my neighbors.
I thought the people screaming outside were so impressed by my talk.
They were. They were.
They could be. You know, Phil.
We have it on a big screen outside, Phil. I was cheering.
I just wanted to say, Phil, from your talk, what impressed me so much was how much the love for your sister came throughout that whole presentation. I know that I was really touched by that. And for those of you in the audience who are listening in, you probably wondered why I invited these specific panelists, because obviously there's so many people who are knowledgeable about cults and the law, especially within our network. And I invited these specific panelists because they were mentioned specifically in Phil's talk. And I thought, what better way to help, widen the depth of this presentation. And I thank you all so much for being here. Participants, feel free, now's the time to send in your chat questions for everybody. You will be able to do that via the Q&A function. And let me see here. I just wanted to make sure that we are recording. We are recording. Okay.
I think we just have one, Bill Goldberg. We need to unmute.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for noticing.
We want to hear from you, Bill.
Phil, I wanted to thank you, having both Joe and I litigated in federal court against the group we were involved in. And we were lucky enough to find
that was a bit of a journey. And the second group I got involved in, going from the frying pan into the fire, was also litigated for his abuse against one of the daughters of a group member, and was on America's Most Wanted, was found guilty of sexual abuse against this young woman and ran off into Mexico, then to India by freighter, and ended up dying there just about 4 years ago.
But I did want to thank you, because if it wasn't for that sole practitioner, his name is Jerry Ragland, who was brave enough to take on a multi-billion-dollar organization with a ragtag bunch of former members who were willing to sleep in his office and go through documents, we wouldn't have gone anywhere. So thank you.
I wanted to say something as well before we go into Q&A. Obviously, a lot has happened with NXIVM since you last gave that presentation, Phil. What were your thoughts on the final ruling and ending the the conclusion to that in the legal courts? Any thoughts that you would like to say?
I was actually watching the video. I was pretty prescient. I mean, I think what I thought was going to happen, happened as it played out, and I don't take anything back with respect to it, but I think what you're now going to see is a playing out on the civil side of these claims and the efforts by people to pursue claims, particularly against Claire Bronfman, because there's the pot of money that's sitting out there and the lawsuit's been filed. And I think it's interesting. I think it raises, the questions it raises are maybe less interesting legally than they are in other ways, but I may be the only person that has some sympathy for Claire Bronfman, and Allison Mack. But we'll see what plays out.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I don't think you're the only one, Phil. I think I also, as an ex-member, have a sense of even those ex-members who rose to the top of the pyramid and ended up getting close to leadership and enacting the desires of leadership, were still under the influence from the very beginning. So there is a bit of that, concern
Two specific things about that I would say. One is, when I was dealing with NXIVM, I had the sense that enormous amounts of Ranieri's attention were devoted to the control of Claire Bronfman, because he really did have an understanding of how important his money was to her. And that was, true throughout it. The other thought I had, maybe will come up later because it's escaped my mind at the moment. But that was certainly true with respect to the Ranieri group.
Well, thank you. Thank you for weighing in on that. I was thinking that while watching your presentation, like, man, things have changed a little bit since that first occurred.
We have this thing coming up shortly. The other people are going to be sentenced. And do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, yeah. Well, the 3 people that are left to be sentenced, the one in particular, yes, I do. I mean, I think that from my perspective, there's a mother and daughter that are waiting to be sentenced. And I actually attended the trial and sat in the overflow room when the daughter, Lauren Salzman, testified. And the judge, I watched the judge react to Lauren Salzman. And whatever he got about the monstrous nature of NXIVM before her testimony, I'm not clear about, but I'm absolutely clear that while she testified, he got it. She was a broken person testifying, and profoundly sad, and I don't think he's going to send her to prison for a long time. Her mother is in a different category, and from my perspective, is certainly, if I'm dealing with from villain to victim, this is me as a person, maybe not so much as a lawyer, was certainly more of a villain than Claire Bronfman. Right, both of them right up there, I would say. But the mother, I think, is going to be sentenced severely, and the third woman is just a brainwashed member.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you for weighing in on that. It looks like we are getting questions rolling in. And since we have about a full hour for questions today, I wanted to just briefly give you, the panelists, a chance to say a few words about yourself. And just to let people know who are asking questions who may not know who you are before we dive into the Q&A. So Ryan, would you like to get started?
Yes, so I'm Pat Ryan, and I was in a group from the age of 17 to about 25, which is the Transcendental Meditation Movement. And I also had a sister who was in a group, the Way International. And as part of the intervention to help my sister leave the Way International, I participated and saw the parallels and the similarities. And I severed my ties with the TM organization and then litigated against them in federal court for fraud and negligence, intentional infliction of emotional distress. That went on for many, many years. And I've been working as a cult interventionist for almost 38 years.
Thank you. Joseph Kelly.
Yeah, I was involved in 2 different groups, TM like Pat, and we litigated against the TM movement while I was involved in the second group called the International Society of Divine Love, Incorporated. As a result of my experience at the behest of my attorney, he suggested I attend something called the Cult Awareness Network Conference. So I was in a cult, not realizing it. And I remember sitting across the table from Margaret Singer, who was an expert witness in my case. And she said to me, just one simple question. Joe, after I told my story, she said, Joe, what makes you think that being involved with the second group is in any way different from the first? Do you see a difference? And I was like reeling back a simple question, an obvious question that I had never asked myself. And that began the process of unraveling for me. And while attending the Cult Awareness Network conference and seeing that there was this body of information apart from the ideas of the group, that there was this thing called undue influence, mind control, other ex-members talking about their experiences, I began to think, is there some way that I could be experiencing those same things? And when I went back to the guru and he asked me, so what did you experience at this Cult Awareness Network conference? I said, oh, they were talking about something called mind control. I was blowing it off. And he looked scared to death. He almost went white. And I thought, there is something up here. And that began my process of backing out of the group. And it took a full year for me to really see clearer. But without that body of information coming from the experts like Margaret Singer and Jolly West and Bill Goldberg and Lorna in those days, I wouldn't have had the foundation to be able to understand what I was involved in. So I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Joe. And yes, I can surely hear the honking celebrations outside here.
Yeah, it's happening, and Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great.
A lot of reasons to be happy.
Adds to the discussion, no problem. Bill, I'd like to pass it on to you, but I would like to quickly say, Bill actually gave a wonderful talk. I don't know how many of you have been able to hear it, back in Philadelphia earlier this past year. And it was on the legal case of the kids of Bourbon County. And if this is your first time listening to Phil about this specific case that he referenced, I highly encourage you to check out Bill's talk. It's a very interesting mirror conversation to what Phil had to say. It's on the ICSA YouTube channel. I just wanted to briefly say that. So Bill.
Thanks, Ashlen. I'm a clinical social worker and psychoanalyst. And 44 years ago, my wife, Lorna, and I, Lorna is also a clinical social worker and psychoanalyst, started a group for former cult members. We got involved because a relative of Lorna's got involved with a cult. And the family attempted to get this person out. And at first it failed. A second subsequent attempt succeeded. And the person's out and doing fine now. But because we were social workers and we wanted to help, at that time there was only one other support group for former cult members, and that was Margaret Singer's in California. The reason I'm mentioning that is because most of the people that get involved in cult work have had some kind of family experience or personal experience. And I'm struck by that. I'm struck by that because it helps to be able to understand what's going on in the cults. That, as Phil said so well in his talk, you know, the usual kinds of legal yardsticks that are used don't exactly fit. And those of us that get involved because of personal experiences have an understanding, because we've seen things that are difficult to put into professional jargon words, but things that were unacceptable in our family members. Having said that, I also want to contradict myself, which my wife tells me I do often. And that's to say that from a psychotherapeutic point of view, it's helpful to have a therapist who understands cults, but it's not necessary. What's important is that you have a psychotherapist who listens to you, who doesn't come in with a preconceived notion and dismisses your experience, but listens and talks it out with you, and it joins you in trying to understand what the cult experience was for you, and not based on readings or based on preconceived notions. So I want to get to a question that I'm frequently asked and I haven't been asked yet, which is there's nobody in my area who is a cult expert, a psychotherapist. What do I do? And my answer is a simple one, but I know it's perhaps too simplistic. You find yourself a good therapist who will listen to you and will help you and will join you in a journey together. You don't necessarily need somebody who's an expert. I'm not ruling out someone who's an expert in this area as someone that can help. But it's a good start, but it's not the whole ballgame.
Well, just build off of something that you said. I mean, obviously, well, I don't know if it's obvious, but we've been in this field for a very long time. And certainly when I left the group in the early 80s, there weren't therapists who were former members or were cult aware.
Right.
One of the things that the International Cultic Studies Association, under Herb, under Phil, has been to encourage former members to go on and become attorneys, therapists. And so we have the Paul Grosswalds, we have the Jan Jelaviches, we have the Roseanne Henrys, the Nancy Michelons, we have the people who were former members that were encouraged to go on and get their advanced degrees, and they're here now. And so it's a great achievement in many ways.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Just real quickly, my name is Ashlen Hilliard. I am the assistant to the executive director for ICSA. I typically help moderate these events and organize and communicate with panelists. So I just wanted to briefly let everyone know that. Phil, is there anything you'd like to say? Obviously, you were briefly introduced before your talk, before we dive into the Q&A round. Oh, you're muted, Phil.
You're muted, Phil. Phil, you're muted. There you go.
I got it. I think it's fair to just simply describe myself at this point as a recovering lawyer. I spend my time writing these days and enjoying that very much. And so that I'm not, to the extent there are questions about, I've taken on my last case is the best way I would describe it. So, and anybody who really needs legal advice about a very specific situation is going to have to consult somebody specific in the area in which they live or in which the situation arose. But I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that Icsa has made my talk available.
Thank you, Phil. All right, well, I'm ready to dive in. I don't know about you guys. Hopefully we provided enough context for people in the audience to help with their questions. We're gonna try to get through as many of these as time allows. So let's get rolling. Someone just wanted to make a comment. Hello, old friends. It was Marcy Rudin. She said that you gave a wonderful talk, Phil.
Thank you very much.
The next question came through. Phil, any suggestions about how to get over the first hurdle? Oh, I'm sorry, how to get over the hurdle of First Amendment's free exercise of religion and actions against extreme religious cults?
Yeah, I guess the best way that I would answer that is without knowing more of the specifics, is not to focus on the First Amendment and get into complicated discussions of what is and is not protected by the First Amendment, but rather focus on the specific practice and the harm it does, and focus on whether or not the particular practice violates rules that protect children with respect to abuse, for example, if children are involved, rules, the various panoply of laws that affect people. I think that sometimes getting into debates about the First Amendment can become a little bit like getting into debates about cults. The First Amendment doesn't excuse criminal activity. It doesn't excuse intentional infliction of emotional distress. And beyond that, without knowing more of the specifics, I don't really have anything to add.
May I draw a parallel here also in terms of deciding whether a loved one is involved in a destructive organization? I get calls all the time from families that say, my son or daughter or brother or sister has joined an organization. I don't know whether it's a cult or not. Is it a cult? And it's just similar to what Phil would say. The issue is not whether you define the group as a cult or not. It's an understandable thing to say, but that doesn't answer. Whether I call the group a cult or not isn't the answer. The answer is what's happening to the person that you're concerned about. Are they acting in such a way that they're narrowing their consciousness, that they're not allowing themselves to be open to other possibilities, to other yardsticks, familiar yardsticks, friends, family, the people that they usually rely on? Or are they going off in a direction without a view of where they're going, where this is going to end up? Whether the group is defined as a cult or not is almost irrelevant. What's important is what's happening to that person. Are they in trouble? And then it becomes irrelevant whether it's a cult.
I think there's a statement that Michael Langone, the the executive director of ICSA responds to those questions when families call. He asked them, if I didn't give it the label of cult, would you be still concerned? Is the behaviors, do you see changes that you're concerned about? Is it that label that makes you upset? Without that label, are you still upset? And if you are, then we should address it.
Yeah, thank you. Someone asked the question, I'd love to know a little more detail about the internet and protection/safety. I am very active on social media and recently out of a group. Is it safe to mention names? Are there guidelines that you would recommend for exposing whistleblowing? Also, I appreciate that you framed it in terms of a mental health need. I understand that this desire to fight will probably subside over time, but for right now, it feels essential. Thank you. That's an excellent question. Thank you, whoever wrote that.
That is a wonderful question, and I've dealt with this issue a lot, and frankly, more in the troubled teen industry context than in the cultic area, where kids that were abused in rehab centers and associated with the troubled teen industry have done a marvelous job of organizing themselves and exposing the industry on the internet. And that's changed a lot over the years. I'm going to sort of change the focus a little bit in the way that I answer the question by changing the focus to money. Because as a practical matter, people wanting to expose groups on the internet have been stopped really only where the group they left has as part of their policy the use of their money to scare people into shutting up. And what's happened is they'll threaten lawsuits with lawyers writing letters on fancy bond stationery that can be intimidating. This is an area where I said in my talk, and finding a lawyer, a volunteer lawyer, can often just by standing up for you and sending a letter back to the person on the other side that essentially says, F you, you're not gonna, the First Amendment protects us. Often they'll go away. Obviously, you should not say things that are not true on the internet. And if you're going to use names, you have to be particularly careful. And I would be especially careful if I start accusing particular people of engaging in particular criminal activity. And it gets even worse if you start accusing people of particular sexually inappropriate activity. I think you really need to be careful, and I would not rush to be naming names, because that is certainly something that can trigger a lawsuit. But the First Amendment, really the same First Amendment that protects groups and inappropriate conduct in groups, protects people that want to speak on the internet. And the protections there are broad. So, and in terms of the last part of the question, which is whether the need to fight will subside over time, that varies enormously from person to person. I don't think there's a right answer in that. I know people who have found meaning in their lives by fighting people that abuse them. And I know other people who have figured out they needed to go on with their lives. And I've learned enough to know that I shouldn't project my views onto people. Everybody needs to find their own truth,
yeah,
particularly in that area.
Thank you. I felt like that statement was really raw. The statement of, I understand that this desire to fight will probably subside over time, but for right now, it feels essential. And I know many former members of groups feel that and ask that question. So thank you. It was a very vulnerable question to ask. Anything to add to that from the panel before I move to the next one?
I picketed my group. I challenged them by setting up a ex-member organization along with Pat Ryan and a friend, Diane Hendel. And that was probably for, very active for the first 10 years of my recovery. But I've been out of the groups for 30 years now, and I shifted my attention into other areas. And I found that to be as satisfying as was that period of very active fighting against the group I was involved in.
I think that when we were young and filled with youthful exuberance and idealism, fighting the group that we left was had a value. We had maybe some misconceptions that we could stop the group. It certainly existed prior to the internet, and so getting information out there about the group was one of our goals. And with the internet, it's not necessary, but it's a different time now, and that the usefulness of picketing and doing the activities that we did maybe interfere with some people's progress, but it certainly at the time felt very good to do. There was also a cost in that. There was an emotional cost. And going up against some groups, there were legal costs. It often was not fun having private investigators parked in front of my house for weeks and weeks at a time, sometimes months. That became annoying. So there's a tension between that desire to be an activist and there's maybe the needs to reframe your life in some way.
Thank you. Bill, did you have anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I would just point out, I'm not sure how helpful this is, but it's a fact that when people have been in a cult for many years, they've repressed their anger. Anger is a natural emotion. It's a natural emotion, especially when someone is abusing us. And in the cult, I'm making a generalization here, obviously, but in the cult, because the cult leader was seen as all powerful and as flawless, people couldn't express their natural annoyance or anger at the cult leader. Sometimes they deflected it onto another person in the cult. Sometimes they internalized it and deflected it onto themselves and became depressed when they were in the cult. And when the bonds of the cult are loosened and they begin to be able to see things in perspective, people become overwhelmed often by the fury that they've repressed all those years, and I'm not prescribing any particular action right now, except it's sometimes wise to wait and not act on that understandable fury until you've had some perspective. And I should also mention some of the patients that I've worked with have been frightened by the degree of their fury and the degree of revenge fantasies that they have. But it's understandable in the context of all this stuff that they've been holding inside for so many years. Where you go with that is another story, and as everyone here is saying, you should be wise and careful. There's other ways of expressing anger. There's other ways of getting back at people, and one of them is by getting a hold of yourself and living the life that you were denied in the cult despite them, and that's a good way to say F you.
I think there was just one thought. I know that when we left the group that we were in, we were out picketing and causing a little ruckus, being on national TV. The organization was worth about $2.5–3.5 billion. And when the leader died, it was worth about $14 billion. So the idea that we were going to be able to stop it by those actions, we didn't accomplish that, but we did get rid of a lot of negative energy and negative feelings that maybe could have been done in a different way, especially in an environment now where we have cult-aware therapists.
Also, Pat, you remind me to just say there's no right way of dealing with having left the cult.
That's right.
And for those that decide on social action, that's great, fine. For those that decide on educating people, that's fine, or speaking publicly, or just deciding to focus on yourself. all of those are acceptable ways of dealing with coming out of the cult, and try not to get involved with deciding that there's a better way or a worse way, which is what the trap that you fell into in the cult. There was the right way and then there's a wrong way. It's what's best for you. And that's what you've got to work on and decide.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent discussion. Someone said, thank you, very clear and informative. I understand that there is no law about cults, although I'm wondering about emotional abuse. I have heard it is almost impossible to prove that. Is that true? I'm going to direct this to Phil first.
Yeah, so no, there clearly is law involving intentional infliction of emotional distress, just like there's clearly law involving undue influence. Again, I'm going to come back to what I said before about money and how you get lawyers. In order to find a lawyer to represent you in an emotional distress case, the lawyer needs to conclude that there's a prospect of getting money that will justify the amount of time that they'll need to spend, even if they do it as a volunteer. And the problem is that emotional distress cases in general, unless they're also associated with a significant physical injury or some egregious violation of law, like the emotional distress that follows a sexual abuse or egregious sexual conduct. Emotional distress cases don't typically yield big damages, and as a result, it's very difficult to find lawyers who will pursue the case for emotional distress. Juries just don't give significant sums of money in general where the only claim is emotional distress. Now, if the facts are particularly egregious, there are certainly exceptions, and with respect to every answer I provide, the facts, change the facts and I may give you a different answer, but so there you can, damages for emotional distress are collectible. They're just not usually easy to come by in sufficient amount to allow you to invest for somebody to make an investment in the case. And that's the problem.
Yeah, thank you.
Again,
oh, go ahead, Bill. No, go ahead, Bill. Yeah.
I'll just jump in to say that all of us, as we were growing up when we were children, we thought that the world was fair, and that if we were good and we were nice, the world would reward us. There's a group of preschool kids that meet near me during the pandemic, and they play a song, something about, if I'm nice to you, you'll be nice to me, and that's the golden rule, and it's sweet and it's good. As we grow older, we learn that the world, unfortunately, is a capricious place, and sometimes it's not fair. But there is a part of us that still wants to believe that this was awful, what happened to me, and there should be some kind of retribution. It's not right. I'm not suggesting that, and none of us, I think, are suggesting don't pursue things. It's just do it in a mindful way. And we all have to come to grips with the fact that there isn't the kind of fair universe that we wish had existed when we were children. We still cling to that, even as adults.
I was thinking of what the investment is from an attorney's point of view in pursuing or representing someone on a lawsuit. And I know in our lawsuits, I think our attorney invested just in one of the cases about 4 years, huge sums of money on expert witnesses, time, weeks and weeks in depositions, a 3.5-week trial in federal court, and the verdict was $138,000. So if by the time all of the expenses were paid and the experts are paid for that investment of years, the attorney probably made $30,000. And so on one side, it seems like a lot of money, but there's a huge investment on the attorney's side. And
yeah.
It's a big risk.
Yeah. We have a few questions coming through about the nuances between coercion, undue influence, and duress. Someone also brought in to mention the UK law on coercive control. So I'm going to actually combine a few of these questions just for a broader discussion, and I'd love to hear from any of you on this. So someone asked about the nuances that make the meaning of these terms different. And again, that's coercion, undue influence, and duress. Are there any other legal terms you would lump in with these? Another person asked, just wanted to quickly throw this out. The presenter mentioned that there is no legal definition for a cult, and probably unlikely to be, which is understood. However, he also made reference to undue influence. Sorry if I missed it, but do courts, US or otherwise, recognize the term undue influence in any way?
So the answer to that question is yes, and this has been something that's been a little bit understood. There is a clearly and well understood established body of law with respect to undue influence. It's most usually applied in the courts in the States in the context of will contests, where somebody says, oh, they changed, the person that died changed their will at the last minute as a result of the undue influence of the person that was taking care of them and left all their money to this, to their young lover, as opposed to the family members who were expecting to get the money. Similarly, there are lots of undue influence cases involving the abuse of people that are frail mentally, and undue influence can also be applied to any situation in which somebody influences somebody in an undue way. These cases are uniquely fact sensitive and depend on finding in a particularly egregious set of facts. And I made reference in my talk to the Holy Trinity and what makes a case a good case or a bad case. But the answer is, if the facts are bad enough and there's a pot of money out there that will be available to divide up at the end, there's no reason why somebody who's the victim of a cult can't find a lawyer to pursue an undue influence case. What I was reacting to in part during the talk was a suggestion that the concept of undue influence ought to be expanded to have a different set of rules when something is cultic, and I don't think that's a realistic expectation.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts on that from the panel? No? Somebody else mentioned, and this is again having to do with coercive control, do you think it's possible that the UK laws around coercive control could ever be extended to include abusive groups?
So that's to me. I know there are such laws in the UK. I don't know them well enough to comment on them. I think if there was one thing that could be done that would be enormously helpful in the legal area, and if Robin Boyle is still on this webinar, I'm talking to you, Robin, is to have somebody do a comparison of the relevant law in a variety of countries of lawyers that have spoken at various Icsa conferences. That nobody's put that together in a serious way. Obviously, other countries don't have the First Amendment, which changes things to some extent in the United States. But I don't have the expertise to comment on different laws in different countries.
I would also defer to Rod and Linda Dubrow-Marshall. They know so much about the coercive control enactments that are going on in the UK right now. I'll make sure after this webinar, if there's any resources or contacts that we mention, I'll make sure and send you guys info on that bill currently, and I'm sure their contact info if you have any questions specifically about what's going on in the UK right now. Somebody said, thanks for a great presentation. Phil, to clarify, you divided lawsuit categories to number 1, criminal law, number 2, family law. Was there a third category?
The third category would have been civil law, lawsuits in which somebody sues somebody else to get money.
Thank you. Somebody asked a question. The Jehovah's Witnesses are extremely litigious, going after former members and trying to uncover the identity of current members who have mentally disconnected, but who are fearful of the severe shunning of this group. Can anyone on the panel speak to experience with this cult?
With the Jehovah's Witnesses? Yeah, I'm sorry, Phil, go ahead.
No, I cannot.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've worked with former members of Jehovah's Witnesses, as has Bill Goldberg and Pat Ryan. As far as litigation, on the basis of shunning, is that what the question was, Ashlen?
Yeah, going after former members and trying to uncover the identity of current members who have mentally disconnected, but who are fearful of the severe shunning of this group.
So we a little off this topic, but related, there is some laws in Europe related to the amount of information the Jehovah's Witnesses hold on people. So when they do their door knocking, that they note who answers the door, how many children there are. That violates some of the privacy laws in some of the countries in Europe. So there's been lawsuits around that, and the Jehovah's Witnesses holding that type of information. But I think what they're probably talking about is that people post under pseudonyms on the internet, and they want to know who is posting. And it's not just that they're posting maybe their own experiences, but they could be posting material that the Jehovah's Witnesses feel is their own copyrighted material, and they want to find out who's doing that posting. The other side, as you go further, further east in Europe, you have laws in the Soviet Union, or former Soviet Union, and Russia, that just being a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses is a criminal act, and people end up in prison. So you have, the laws are different in different countries that relate to the same group, and that can create problems.
Yeah, thank you. Someone asked the question, because our criminal law systems needs a victim, the lawyer who took our case used a mediation approach. This was a civil case type approach that stayed out of the courts. She went for the insurance company that covered the cult. She reached a settlement based on physical and emotional harm. This is not justice. Because the cult leader has not touched, but the ex-member got financial compensation and can move forward with other aspects of her life. This approach, mediation, spares the ex-member the horrors of a trial. The lawyer got a fee, and it took less than 3 months.
I'm happy to comment on that.
Yeah, please do.
It's something I really do know about. And I don't know about, obviously, this particular case, but the key word in this question is insurance company.
Yeah.
As a practical matter, if you have an insured cult and the cult picks up the claim, everything is different, because the insurance companies don't care about anything other than how much money they're going to spend and whether it's worth it. And they are paying lawyers as well. So insurance companies are in the business of settling cases. The cult didn't care because they paid for the insurance, and obviously the cult leader wasn't harmed. In my kids' cases that I talked about extensively, and I think I made this point, the fact that the cult leader, in that case, Miller Newton, had insured his cult and had medical directors who had malpractice insurance themselves, changed everything, because the insurance companies and the insurance company lawyers grew to hate their insured. They were all, by the time the cases were over, they were all rooting for us once they realized what had happened. They weren't, that's just the nature of insurance, and everything changes. I contrast that with what happened in NXIVM, where the NXIVM ex-members were brutalized by NXIVM because Keith Raniere was able to use Claire Bronfman's money to hire lawyers who were doing the cult fitting and using the legal system as a weapon. And it really was weaponized to hurt ex-members. So everything changes if there's insurance, because you have a party involved for which the only issue is money. And the insurance company can say, I have no idea what happened, Jane, in the particular case you're describing in your case, but the insurance company can settle the case for an amount of money that's not meaningful to them, that is enormously meaningful to the person that receives the money, and justify the amount of time that the lawyer put into the case. And everybody goes home happy, even if justice wasn't served.
That's exactly what happened in the TM lawsuits after the first one went to trial. The insurance companies came up with a number that made it reasonable for people to settle.
I'll just add one more thing, which was, it was really important to me. One of the things that happens in civil cases that is settled with insurance companies is insurance companies routinely ask, as part of settlements, for confidentiality agreements as part of the settlement, and no admissions of guilt and all of that kind of stuff, so that the settlement can't be used in order to expose the group. I think the thing I'm most proud of about my kids' cases way back when is that we made it clear to the insurance companies, and my clients went along with this, that there would be no confidentiality agreements of any kind, and that we'd be able to talk about the case and the settlement, and that people would know that there was significant money involved, because there were so many victims who couldn't bring cases because of the statute of limitations, that were hurt terribly. And the only thing they were getting out of the case was the sense that the villain was being hit back and being punished. And so the one thing I'd say, if you get into the kind of situation that Jane described, if you can avoid a confidentiality agreement and then be allowed to use the settlement as a way to expose the villain, it's great. Sometimes you can't, and there's usually pressure from your own lawyer, the plaintiff's lawyer, to sign the agreement, take the money, and go home. So that's.
Thank you. Somebody asked, they said, I apologize because this isn't exactly a legal question. That's okay. They asked, I am a clinician working with an individual in their early 20s who is part of a group. She has recently began rejecting some of the practices, rituals of the group, and is moving away from participating. She still doesn't seem to be questioning the mystical belief systems that are inherent to the group. And I sense she may be susceptible to a back and forth relationship with the group. I know Pat and Joe always talk about the relationship itself, and she and I have an excellent close rapport. My question is, when someone begins realizing that the promises of the group were actually untrue, or that they were misinformed about the risks of participating, is this a good time to gently question the group's mystical beliefs? Or should I let her take the lead with the pace of walking away? It's a great question.
I mean, you know, I think that you do have to follow your client's lead and make every effort to respect their pacing and go along with that pace. Yet there may be openings if you've reached the end of, you know, the time when, you know, the fundamentals have been dealt with in the therapeutic environment, and still there's more to cover in your concern for their welfare. Bill, I think you'd be best suited to answer where you might go with that when you want to share your legitimate concerns about the individual's continuing belief in magical thinking.
But before you jump in, Bill, I just want to do something maybe to complicate the question a little bit, and maybe you can help. Most beliefs are not rational, and most religions have beliefs that are not rational. So there does become some value judgment as to what beliefs are you should explore and what beliefs you shouldn't explore. And so for that reason, it seems to me that it's almost client-driven, yet beliefs in themselves can be used as a tool to manipulate. So it's not, I don't think there's a clear answer, but Bill is probably the best one to take the question that I've muddled up.
I'll be glad to give my non-answer to this question and just state what we all know. Any kind of therapy, be it Icsa counseling or psychotherapy, is an art, not a science. I'm sorry, Michael Hangoni, but that's my belief.
He's not here, so it's okay.
Okay. I'm sorry, Cynthia.
I think he agrees with that.
and there's no formula as to what the right time is. The important thing and the training of a good therapist is to listen to their client, to be able to pick up when the client is displaying some concerns, and weighing that against the degree of harm that might take place if you don't say something. If I had a client who was planning on, which happened with a client of a supervisee of mine, she was planning on traveling to another country to meet an individual whom she had met on the internet who had made many promises to her. I urged the therapist to raise very serious concerns before you go. On the other hand, if you have someone who, the consequences of their continuing to read literature and continuing to have one foot on the dock and one foot on the boat aren't as immediate, and there you back off and you question. We're always questioning and always saying, what are the alternatives? What do you think the consequences would be? But and also, by the way, I train psychoanalysts, and I always say to them, we've got to be neutral. We can't show, but we're not neutral. The issues that we pick up on are the issues that resonate with us. Sometimes we go, you know what we do, and sometimes we go, let's look at that. And the things that we choose to say that let's look at it are the ones that resonate with us. So as much as we try to be non-judgmental and neutral, we're human beings and we pick up on these things. And again, sometimes what you do is to weigh the alternatives. It's certainly best in theory for the patient to come to their conclusions on their own without your influencing them. And in most cases, that's the best thing to do, to be a good listener and to question. There are times that I've had to say, why am I the only one in this room who's very concerned about that decision that you just made?
I was thinking about a concrete situation of a group that Joe and I both worked with a young woman, and the group had some ideas and beliefs about goddesses and the communication between goddesses and humans. And this woman applied to go to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania to become a certified nurse practitioner midwife. And at her interview at University of Pennsylvania, they asked the question why she wanted to be a midwife. And her response was, because the goddesses told me. So when she came back from her interview, she said, I think I might have screwed up the interview. And I said, what do you just tell them? And she told that story. And I said, well, maybe we should talk about what do you mean by the goddesses talking to you? And maybe you want to talk to a therapist about the goddesses. We understood where it came from, but for her, that belief had become real to the point where she was hearing them talk. And so the belief needed to be examined because it had a repercussion on her ability to pursue the career that she wanted to pursue. The next year she was accepted, and now she's a professor and PhD, but it was that little click, a little chunk that we probably would not dealt with specifically in an intervention, but that because for many people, it would have just been something, a fleeting belief. But for this particular individual, it had an impact upon their life. I guess it's a balancing act for a therapist to make that decision, what to pick up and what not to pick up.
Yeah, thank you. I want to try to get through, if possible, 3 more questions. Obviously, we're running out of time here. And we still have many, many questions, and I apologize. I want to try to get through as many of these as possible.
Ashlen, will I be able to answer questions that are addressed specifically to me after we're done? Will I be able to let people know, or should I just be typing answers to some of them?
Sure, you could, yeah, you could be typing now.
Okay.
Yeah, you could be typing now if you'd like.
Right.
And I believe, Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, but I should get a record of the questions from Zoom. Yeah. So anything that does go unanswered, Phil, I will make sure that you have that information.
I'll screenshot some questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. And does all the panelists today give me permission to let people know if they had any unanswered questions that they can reach out to you all?
Absolutely, sure.
Wonderful. Yeah, because I apologize. We still have like 25 questions, and I'm so grateful that you all have asked your questions today, and I want to make sure that we address as many of those as possible. So let me try to get through 3 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up for today. Somebody asked the question, my internet cult leader brother has caused me and my husband and many others so many problems. Like many cult leaders of known and obscure cults, my brother abuses the courts by filing pro-self-represented lawsuits against me and my husband and others, all of which he's lost, but which has cost us well over $150,000. He's been deemed an abusive litigant and prohibited from suing. We have been working with our state legislator to propose a spontaneous judicial review bill of pro se litigants' complaints as to summarily dismiss meritless and abusive lawsuits and prevent financial damage to innocent defendants. So this person has 2 questions. Number 1, what are your thoughts about the role of judges to intervene in the cases of abusive pro se litigants, some of them cultists, to stop them dead in their tracks? And number 2, what are your thoughts about Francis Picard anti-cult laws, and how could that be adapted by our legislators and courts? Phil, let me know if I need to repeat any of that, or others would like to.
Second part maybe, but let me see if I can address that. The courts and the role of judges, and I just want to turn this question around a little bit. There clearly is sometimes a problem with abuse of the courts by pro se litigants, and judges eventually, in most cases, and I'm not going to comment on this particular case, figure it out, and then they do utilize a whole variety of techniques to stop pro se litigants in their tracks. But the other side of that is, and I'm going to use the NXIVM story in particular, judges assume that lawyers, and particularly lawyers from well-established firms that come from the same kind of firms that the judges came from before they became judges, are acting in good faith. And when lawyers take money, and in some cases, lots of money, in order to use the courts to abuse ex-members, they get away with that ad nauseum. And somebody asked me about, in the context of the NXIVM case, what my thoughts are about what's happened since. And if I have a single thought about the NXIVM case, it is that the lawyers who got all of that Bronfman money and knew or should have known what they were doing to the ex-members who were egregiously abused should have to give the money back, lose their licenses. I mean, I can go on and on and on about, what they did and how awful it was in that context. The Scientology's lawyers over the years that so aggressively took the money. So I'm not minimizing the problems of pro se litigants who are cultists and abuse the courts, and judges can do better. But I'd suggest the other side is a more significant problem, looking over the entire situation. I don't remember the second half of the question. Ashlen, if you want to.
Yes, let me pull it up. What are your thoughts about, Francis, about the card anti-cult law? And how could that be adapted by our legislators and courts?
I'm not big on having, so if the idea is that we have more laws that make it harder for pro se litigant, I'm not so enthusiastic about those.
I think that in terms of this French law, both Joe and I have worked on some cases that law was applied. And when we met with the people who were involved in the group, we determined that it wasn't a group at all. And the law was just used against someone because they weren't liked by the family. Now, they might have been an abusive person, but it was really, in some sense, that a family didn't like the husband or wife and so they used this law and made their lives miserable. The result was the person didn't end up getting put in jail, spent thousands of dollars and years of time, and the family no longer has a relationship with their child. So that law, where in some cases it's been used very effectively with very abusive people groups, where you draw that line, there's not a bright line. It's a very murky area, and that law can be used to actually hurt people. Yeah. So it's a touchy area.
Thank you. It looks like we only have time for one more question, and this actually has to do about recovery. So Bill, I'll probably direct a lot of this towards you, but anyone can pipe in about recovery, of course. Someone asked the question, do you have any suggestions on how to recover from emotional abuse and fear caused by cult leaders who took and victimized a spouse? The spouse is still there, no contact possible, because when we tried in the beginning, while not knowing what was happening, they took me to court and got a judge who was apparently working with them to grant them a protection order against me. This has expired, but it has not been erased. So the question is how to recover from emotional abuse and fear.
I don't have the one solution fits all situation. I can say that all of us respond to these very overwhelming traumatic events in our lives based on our early history before the abuse took place. And each case is different. It requires unraveling what it means to you, what the feelings are, what have you tried to get yourself out of this this situation, the emotional situation, and can you move on by forming new relationships, by working on the relationships that can be improved, and by jettisoning the relationships that can't be. And again, I know that that's a very unsatisfying answer, but it depends on the situation. I can't give a general response to it, except that the goal is your health and your well-being for the rest of your life. That's one thing that you have a bit more control over than whether the person that you love who is being victimized is going to be able to recognize that victimization.
Thank you.
Yeah, good solid advice. And what I experienced myself, you know, I'm working with a therapist in my coming out of the cult, and what I recommend to my friends and ex-members who are looking to work with a mental health professional. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. I wanted to comment, actually. I have a comment. Rod Dubrow-Marshall commented on the coercive control laws, and I just wanted to briefly voice his response. He said, "Hi, this is Rod and Linda Dubrow-Marshall. Great talk in session, everyone. On the coercive control law in England and Wales, this is being extended to an extent from intimate relationships to forced marriage and honor-based abuse in families and communities. We also have trafficking and modern slavery laws, which can apply to an abusive group or cult. And there are similar laws in the US, and Robin Boyle has written some great work on that. Also in Canada, contract law has been used in many cases involving religious communities and prenup marriage contracts. The laws of unjust enrichment can be applied in ways that avoid freedom of religion concerns and laws. We are very happy to dialogue with interested parties, so please do pass along our email address. Thank you, Rod and Linda. I so appreciate you piping in. And of course, they are running a master's degree program in the UK if you are interested specifically on coercive control. It has been a great program. I am in it myself, so I can voice to that. Thank you. So I'll pass along their info to all of those who attended today as well. I just want to end today by thanking everybody so much. Pat has helped me by screenshotting the remaining questions. We will try to get back to you. I will also provide you with all the speakers' email information so that you can reach out to them if you had a question that you maybe thought of later. And I want to thank everybody for participating today and for voicing such vulnerable questions, many of them. They have not gone unnoticed. They're really powerful. Anything from the panelists that you would like to, any concluding statements from any of you today?
Just that I'm afraid I won't be able to answer questions for the next maybe hour or so. I'm going to be honking my horn.
Yeah, I have to go out to Broad Street, just a few blocks away, and see what might be happening out there. I think there's a party going on.
Oh, wow.
That's wonderful.
And there's some unhappy people also that are our neighbors, and I think they need hugs.
Yeah, there you go.
Very nice, Pat. Very
Dialogue,
nice.
always sneaking in the points of dialogue. Pat, I love that. Well,
Thank you.
Well, you all, thank you so much, Phil, Pat, Joe, and Bill. And again, everyone. Participants, we will be in touch. Everyone stay safe and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.